Welcome to Second Sunday for September 2023. I'm Paul Lauber, a volunteer with the Friends of Great Swamp. Our Second Sunday programs are made possible by the Friends of Great Swamp and by the generous support of the Martha Heflin Foundation. In 1947, Edwin Teale, one of the most popular nature writers of the 20th century, followed the progress of spring from the Everglades in Florida to Mount Washington in New Hampshire. Teale's best-selling book, North with the Spring, recounts his 4-month journey that he undertook with his wife, Nellie. Today's speaker, John Harris, retraced Teale's route, arriving on the same calendar dates on which the Teals visited. John's 2012 adventure is documented in his 2016 book, Returning North with the Spring. John Harris is an adjunct faculty member in environmental science at Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire. He holds a PhD in British and American literature from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has taught courses in nature writing, environmental literacy, regional history, American literature, and composition at Franklin Pierce University. We are delighted that John is with us today to discuss his historical journey and unique insights. Please join me. Let's welcome author, educator, historian, and naturalist, John R. Harris.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a feeling that many of you are volunteers here at the refuge, and so some of you may be familiar with my wife is in the back, Susie, and our daughter Anna, who is here. I wanted to, before I start with Teale, I looked up Edwin Teale to see if he ever had visited Great Swamp, and I found in his book Wandering Through Winter, there's a chapter on the Great Swamp. Hold off a minute. He says in there, in other parts of the Great Swamp, that rainy day we encountered the plundered hiding places of two less fortunate overwintering insects. On higher ground at one edge of the morass, we saw where a round gall of a goldenrod had been cut open by the chiseled bill of a downy woodpecker. The insect occupant was gone. A little later, we came upon a large silken cocoon of a cecropia moth. It stood out against the rich green of nearby rhododendron. As we drove out, we saw that it had been torn open and rifled. Was this too the work of the downy bill? We backed up and looked more closely. A woodpecker attacked such a cocoon from the front. Here, the silk gaped open from the bottom. This tear was the handiwork not of the bird's bill, but of the little teeth of the white-footed mouse. Give you a sense of what Teale writes about. This Great Swamp is in Rhode Island. Oh. The other thing about it is the cocoon. Anna has slipped out, but the reason that I'm here is because Anna works at the refuge, and one of the ways in which she got interested in the natural world was we found a cecropia cocoon along the side of the road. Anna was about 10 years old at the time, and she said she'd really like to find these, and so we walked along the side of the road and we found about half a dozen. You don't see as many today, cecropia cocoons. We watched them hatch. We allowed the males to mate, and we let them lay eggs. And when the eggs hatched, little tiny sort of stitches of black caterpillars. And so Anna and I every morning would go out and cut cherry leaves, put them in boxes, and by the end, we had very large cecropia caterpillars that spun cocoons, and we had maybe, 15 cecropia cocoons. And that was, to some extent, Anna's start in the love of nature she has. And certainly Teale speaks to that. So I'm going to shift over and now talk about the book. So maybe we'll get the PowerPoint, if you would. Is that what everybody's seeing? Not the big screen, though.
Not the big screen. All right, that's down here. How about that?
I'm small for that here. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good. Your presenter view is okay, but I need. You go ahead.
You want to check something before?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not. I think we're okay.
It was full screen initially and it is not now.
Okay.
It's showing the next slide.
Good here, that's all I can say.
Good, that's right.
That's good.
Should we come, you know?
Let's see what all this looks like. Oh, okay, so we've got. All right. Great, thank you. So the journey that Teale took and that I followed here are the places that I started down in the Everglades, made my way to the top of Mount Washington. I'm gonna not spend a lot of time there, but rather it's not allowing me to.
You can always use.
Technology, there we go.
You can always use that, I guess.
Okay,
Try it again. Oh,
does it
just
now?
needed to start the first
Okay,
one.
all right. So a little bit about Edwin and Nellie Teale, and a little bit about myself. I got interested in nature writing a long time ago. When I did my dissertation, I focused on Wordsworth and Keats, but I was interested, they're British, but I was interested in their nature imagery. So when I started teaching at Franklin Pierce, I started in the English department, but I found fast friends over in the environmental science. And so I sort of shifted over. And the course that I taught in American nature writing included an anthology that had one chapter from Edwin Teals' North with the Spring. Part of the reason I like Teale is I think he's a very fine writer. He's not really a polemic environmentalist that is sort of the way nature writing is today. He's also very interested in phenology, which is the seasonal signs. And the other reason is, unlike someone like Thoreau or John Muir or Edwin Abbey, Edwin Teale starts almost every sentence in his books, we, rather than I, because his partner, his wife, Nellie Donovan Teale, was really very much a close colleague. And in taking this trip, I realized that she was actually the better birder, in some ways the more courageous. Edwin was a fairly retiring individual. So I decided I was going to retrace their trip, which they took in 1947. So I went to the University of Connecticut, where the Teale archive is located, and they were kind enough to Xerox his journal. So when I started my trip, I had 4 200-page journal entries. Each night, Teale, when he finished their exploration for the day, would spend a little time writing up what happened that evening. So I got to know his personality, you know, his reticence and his interest pretty closely. Let's see if this will. The Teals dedicated all 4 of the books they wrote. Their first one was North with the Spring, but the others as well are dedicated to their son, David, who traveled with them in their hearts. And that's because David, as you see here, was drafted into the Army ahead of World War II. And he and his father were very close. He was the only child, grew up as a scout, and volunteered for a mission in the last 2 months of World War II over in France, was sent over to Germany. And on crossing the river back, there were 18 of them and 12 of them were killed. And it devastated Edwin Teale, he and his wife both, but especially Edwin Teale. He thought he may never write again, in fact. They decided, though, in 1947, and I think largely at Nellie's urging, that they should undertake the trip that they had planned to take with their son, David. Along the way, they stayed in little 1-room or 2-room cabins. They took a black Buick sedan. They didn't, some people have asked me, did they walk the trip? They didn't walk it. 17,000 miles in an automobile. But you think back then, and the record of things, every 1,000 miles you had to have the tires changed and oil changed, and gasoline was, about $1.50 to fill the tank. I mean, things were different, but some of these little 1 and 2 room cabins still exist in New Hampshire and Vermont. You don't see them much in New Jersey. Motels have taken the place. I was on sabbatical in 2012 and I got a little grant, but my grant didn't pay for motels all the way along for 4 months. So my motel was the back of my pickup truck. And I had the bicycle and a kayak with me. When our daughters came along, or when my wife Susie was with me, we stayed in something larger than the pickup truck, but for much of the time, that was my home. So in February, they drove down to the Everglades, and these black and white photographs are from Teals' photographic record. He was an accomplished photographer as well as writer. In fact, the first book he has published was mostly photographs. But this is what the roads leading into the Everglades look like. Got to remember, Florida, let somebody come right in. Florida, the record I found was that Florida has had the equivalent of 700 people per day for the last 50 years. That's been the changes that have occurred. I drove further into the Everglades than Edwin Teale ever had the opportunity to. 1947 was just before the inauguration of the national park, and they were in the process of removing people. Because remember, national parks are supposed to kind of create the pre-European contact period. And so there were many people living in Flamingo. Most of them were collecting bird feathers for women's hats and had been down there in the extensive swamp that's at the Everglades. I drove down, you begin it at the Anhinga Trail. Anyone been down the Everglades? Some of you folks. And that's an Anhinga, that's the trail. The other important thing was Teale relied on a series of experts. If you read North with the Spring, you'll see he had been to many of these places before, but he also relied on people who really were the experts in phenology in that area. And I did the same thing. The Everglades poet Anne Sullivan was very gracious in meeting me and spending 4 days showing me around the Everglades. I asked her what her first experience in the Everglades was on that first day, and she said the following. I'll read you just a little bit. She said, the dark outline of a plated gator churns toward the slough, its tail thrashing, wrapped twice around its midsection is an enormous coil of smooth skin python. Dark olive with fawn brown stippling, the snake pokes up its head, its thick muscle searching for another point of anchor. Soon the pair explodes into the water and disappears beneath the lilies, a foaming brown wave scattering birds in all directions. 10 minutes later, the reptiles resurface, the python wrapped tightly around the gator's snout. It lifts its head once more, opens its mouth to breathe, and squeezes with greater force. The alligator responds by again submerging its attacker. This time it's nearly 20 minutes before the pair resurfaces, and the gator has managed to get a piece of the snake's thick midsection between its jaws. The eyes of both creatures, now mere slits, suggest neither retreat nor fright. All afternoon the battle wages. The alligator thrusts up its snout, waiting to feel the pressure subside. The python in response rises above the surface and glares. Hour after hour, from slough to shoreline, the struggle continues. At first light, the creatures remain locked in their embrace, exhausted along shore, each awaiting an uncertain end. Then suddenly, something lets go. A slip of the coil, the jaw relaxed, and the snake hangs free almost without awareness of its uncoupling. Time suspends them for a frozen moment, and then they separate, moving away from each other faster than Anne imagined possible. So I spent the rest of my day standing there looking for a Burmese python. And they are stealth predators. They're invasives, and I'll have a lot to say about invasives. Those of you who work here know a lot about invasives. Imagine at least you don't have to, when you're out there pulling plants, worry about Burmese pythons. They don't really attack people very much, but they have. The word is that 90% of small mammals, so you think about raccoons and possums and even fawns, have been eliminated in the Everglades because of the Burmese python. And they really have no idea how many there are, but it's into the thousands. One of the things about the Everglades, I went down to Flamingo, which is where Echo Pond is. There are a series of ponds. Most of them are man-made there, shallow depressions. They're really designed for wading birds to be able to feed. The bird that I had never seen before, the roseate spoonbill, is there. And there, hundreds of people with their cameras. Most of them were about half my age, but it was fun to talk with the birders, and I'm sure all of you have a chance to talk with birders here. I decided I should try some things by myself. So, and one afternoon I said I wanted to kayak in Hell's Bay. So I headed out that way, and I thought, well, they're PVC pipes that take you out. And so I thought, I'm going to try to just go off course. And you pretty quickly get lost. And it was, in some ways, the Everglades was the wildest place I explored, because you can get lost and be lost for quite a long time there. I found my way back to the PVC pipes, but you notice on that little map that there are those little like huts are little chickees. They're platforms in the mangrove swamp. I thought I'd take a picture of this. That's one of the highest elevations in the Everglades. And the prediction is by 2050, there might be 3 feet of water in the Everglades, salt water coming in. So if you want to get to the Everglades, you probably should do that. Certainly climate change is affecting it. From there, I headed to Lake Okeechobee, which was the next place that Teale visited in early March. And Paul Gray, who works for the Audubon Society in Okeechobee, was really excited. He was a little like Paul here, wanted to really get to know the Teale record of things. So he said he'd be happy to take me out to the same place that Teale counted glossy ibis. And so the next opportunity here, I'll read you, this is the picture. That's a glossy ibis, spectacularly beautiful bird. And that's a picture that Teale took, and he wrote, the flocks ranged from 30 to 70 to several hundred and came in waves minute after minute. Once 500 birds stretched in one vast struggling line for miles along the horizon, advancing across the sky like wave marks on a smooth sandy beach. The total count was 2,307 glossy ibis. All the glossy ibis on the North American continent were concentrated in a single acre on this single bar or island in Lake Okeechobee. So we headed out, parked his boat, and we counted glossy ibis. The we being our youngest daughter. You'll see her in a minute. And there were 210 glossy ibis. And yet, as we rode home in the airboat, we were both smiling because Paul Gray assured me that Lake Okeechobee has as many glossy ibis today as it did in 1947. The difference is that hurricanes have knocked a lot of the mature willow trees in Kings Bar down, and they're forced to nest and roost in other smaller islands. But in fact, the numbers are not diminished. And in a way, I had expected in my trip that I would hear about diminishment everywhere I went. And part of the reason that the trip was so enjoyable was that that's not the case. I'll show you that a number of places and a number of reasons that places that have been protected have remained biodiverse. So From there, the Teals headed to up to the Kissimmee Prairie. It's the largest intact grassland prairie in the East Coast. And they were looking for three birds in particular. One, sandhill crane. Everybody, we see sandhill cranes up this way even. They're all over Florida. This is a not very good picture I took of a crested caracara, which is in the falcon family. It's really a bird that comes up from Mexico, but it was nesting there. And the last one, we looked at a hole for a gopher tortoise, and in fact, it's the home of a burrowing owl. Pretty rare little bird popped out of the hole, and so the three that the Teals saw, we had a chance to see as well. From there, they had been invited by Marjorie Kinnan Rollins to her home in Cross Creek. She's the author of The Yearling. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows that book. When I talk with my students about The Yearling, it might be a baseball team or something. And it was interesting. Here's what Teale wrote in his journal. She said Rollins had prepared a picnic lunch of fried chicken, boiled eggs, potato salad, layer cake, and fresh oranges. Later that evening, back in Cross Creek, she served them boiled halves of grapefruit, scrapple, string beans, baking powder biscuits, mangoes, and a special food for the gods, the white heart of a cabbage palm. And I say, even with these culinary efforts, it was insufficient, for in Teale's journal, he lavishes praise, or in his account in North with the Spring, he lavishes praise, but in his journal, he says, she is generous in the extreme, but not gracious or thoughtful. We had the feeling of being objects of charity. And I thought, oh, after meals like that, that's Marjorie Kinnan Rollins. And I was thinking, why is that? Part of it, I think, was she was kind of a hard-boiled New Yorker. She was a chain smoker. She was a hard drinker. The Teals were Quakers. They were quite reserved. But I think more than that, she had really established roots in a community in Cross Creek. She wrote a wonderful memoir called Cross Creek. So if you're interested, it's a great book. And I think that Edwin Teale was maybe a little envious of the fact they lived in Baldwin, New York at the time. Baldwin was undergoing a lot of development. In fact, an area that had been his butterfly garden was taken over to make an elementary school. And so the kind of rootless feeling that they had, especially Edwin, compared with Rollins, I think was behind some of that message. So if you look out from Rollins, she has a little deck out there and an area that you can put a boat launch. You see water hyacinth everywhere. Water hyacinth is all over the, not up this way, but the lakes and ponds and rivers in Florida. And I put it in there because Teale mentions in his book that that water hyacinth, the Japanese had given as a gift in one of the opportunities for countries to come together. They didn't realize that it would take over the way it has as an invasive, but the US thought they had an answer to that. They were going to bring an animal over to help get rid of the water hyacinth. Any idea what the animal would be? Some of you have read the book, but they thought the answer was a hippopotamus. And so in the 1930s, there was a request that went all the way through Congress, and there were only a couple of congressmen and senators that stopped hippopotami from being imported. It was not only to eat water hyacinth, but there was a meat shortage at the time, and they figured that hippopotamus would be a great answer to the meat shortage. So they're invasives. We have snakes. Fortunately, we don't have hippopotamus here. From there, they went up to Edward Ball Lounge. There were a number of places that had been designed near the springs. They're limestone springs in Florida. They're warm water. They provide access to the rivers. And the one at Wakala Spring had become famous. I took a look at the inside. I was hoping that maybe their register would include Teal's name, but they didn't keep track of that. So I took the boat, the boat that the Teals took, and headed down, took some photographs of different birds and plants there on the March 21st, the first real day of spring. That's the cry of a limpkin. That's the kind of bird. That's what the Teals came for. They wanted to see the limpkin. And in fact, Teale wrote there, he could not imagine Wakala Springs without the cry of limpkins. Quote, "It was the voice of the dark, the swamp, the vast wilderness of ancient times. It links us as it will link men and women of an even more urbanized, regimented, crowded tomorrow with days of lost wildness." When I got there, no limpkins. They're not sure whether the water temperature or whether some, runoff had been the reason. I thought, well, here's clearly a sign of diminishment. I talked with Paul Gray, and he said, well, yeah, the numbers are down. It turns out today the numbers are not down nearly as strikingly. And the reason are the snails. Apple snails are what limpkins and snail kites eat. And this is an invasive apple snail that came into Florida in the 1990s. And at first, Audubon thought, man, we ought to get rid of this invasive Mexican apple snail. But it turns out they're larger, they're more prolific, and the number of limpkins and the number of snail kites started to go up fairly dramatically. So it's an example of an invasive that actually has been beneficial to the, at least to the bird ecosystem. From there, I headed across Florida up to Georgia and the Okefenokee Swamp. And this is one, it was a refuge. And the Teals visited a number of refuges. I have pictures of some I want to talk about. This is the first one. So from a national park that really was just beginning to get its foundation, the Okefenokee was a 10-year-old refuge. It had been given to the government about 10 years before the 1947 photograph. And as you notice, it was given because every log that could be taken had been taken out of that refuge. You don't see much in the way of trees. There was a railroad that ran out into the swamp so that they could get cedar and everything else. So here's what it looks like 65 years later. And that's the story of so many places that have been protected. You think about it, 70 years of biodiversity have a chance to bring back. Here's another picture of the swamp. I took my kayak, the Teal spent 3 days. I spent 3 days winding through there. Nellie Teale was very excited to see a single wild alligator in the Okefenokee because most alligators were shoes and belts at that time. We didn't have them. Today, 10,000 alligators. When you put a kayak in, you almost bump into an alligator. You have to get used to having alligators looking at you while you're looking at them in the Okefenokee. Took me a while, but. So from there, our oldest daughter is kind of more of a city girl than Anna is refuge. So I met her in Charleston. The Teals had spent a couple of days kind of, I think, retooling from all of the time in the wilds to walk the streets of Charleston and spend time in a hotel there. There were flower festivals going on. Here's a picture of some wisteria in bloom. But the flower festival dates had to be moved up in early April because 2012 was the hottest spring on record, broken by 2013, broken again and again by 2023. So, yep, the temperature's going up, but we had a good time. The The next spot the Teals visited was Bull's Island, which is part of the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. So, and this was the week that I think changed Teale from the early journal entries. He still was kind of under that dark cloud of thinking about his son and his son not being able to accompany him. They had a week on Bull's Island where they were away from having to drive around different places. There weren't a lot of people, only the refuge manager and his wife were there. So they could spend time walking the sand trails and birding. And his mood and kind of the language that he uses on the second half of the trip really is much more a kind of rebirth of the season as well as a rebirth in his own temperament. So that was the tower, and he climbed that tower and took a picture of Bull's Island from the top in 1947. And I was determined, that tower doesn't look quite the way it did but I determined I'm going to do the same thing. So I took a picture from that tower. And the island has changed very little. They've had some hurricanes come through. He took a marvelous picture of the only house that's on the island. I took a less spectacular picture of the same house that's there, but it was really as close as I got to Edwin and Nellie Teale. I was able to sit at the same kitchen table, to walk the same hallways, those same trails. I thought, well, I want to try to do an accurate bird count. And Fish and Wildlife always comes through. Tricia Lynch was their communications person. She invited David McLean, who was a professional birder. And we spent 5 days seeing if we could match the bird count that the Teals had. They counted 62 different species, and he listed each of them. We counted 60 species, so not exactly the same, but once again, not what you would anticipate for loss. And the Bull's Island has not only a shoreline, so you have ocean wading birds, but you also have ponds. There were a number of alligators there as well, but there were quite a few birds that enjoy freshwater as well. From there, I headed to the Ducktown Desert. Anybody been to the Ducktown Desert? I don't imagine you have. Here's what Teale said about the Ducktown Desert. You know, why he went here, I'm not sure, but I think it was well known. He said, "We came suddenly on a nightmare region, a land of death and desolation. The trees disappeared. At first, the great rolling hills supported dead grass and a few stunted oaks scattered at rapidly widening distances. Then even these stunted trees disappeared, and mile after mile we drove through bare slopes where what remained of the broken sod hung like pieces of hide on the red clay of the exposed hillsides. Blighted into nightmare form, the countryside seemed almost lifeless." It's Tennessee, near the Tennessee-Georgia border. And the reason for that coloration is they mined copper there. They brought copper to the surface and roasted it. And when you roast copper, the byproduct is sulfur dioxide, which is a gas. It heads up into the atmosphere, mixes with water, and rains down as sulfuric acid. And so 40 square miles looked like that. In fact, I learned afterward that the first environmental lawsuit that the Supreme Court heard was Georgia sued Tennessee, saying if they couldn't get rid of that sulfuric acid, they're ruining the farmland. And the judges agreed. They said either you find a way to capture the sulfuric acid or you stop production of copper. And they did. The second important product from copper production was sulfuric acid. When I drove into Ducktown, that's what it looked like. State government and a lot of federal money for acid-hardy legumes first, and then for pine trees. There's really almost no evidence as you drive through Ducktown that any of that once occurred. The only place you see it is the old mine spot itself. And there's a museum, a Ducktown mining museum. I stopped there, and the docent who took me through was a woman whose father and husband had both worked in the mines. In fact, she still lived in one of the houses that the mining company had owned and built. And when I said to her, "What do you think of all this green?" she shook her head and she said, back then we had no snakes, no spiders, no bugs, just that prettiest shade of red. People have their own sense of place. So. From there, the Teals actually from there went to visit Edwin's mother, who lived in West Virginia, wasn't well, and they visited there. They dropped down into New Orleans. I decided I didn't want to go all the way down to New Orleans, so I kind of cut my trip a little bit short. You think about it, April 20th, at least in New Hampshire, April 20th into May is really spectacularly, if you're a bird fan, a great time. That's by the 7th of May, the hummingbirds are back, the Baltimore Orioles are back, the bluebirds are nesting. So I was getting a little homesick myself. So I sped ahead. I read the two people who are Debbie Donnelly and not remembering the name of the other person who's a landscape. They headed up the landscaping of Jefferson's home. And I read them the list, fairly extensive lists that the Teals had compiled of flowers that were in bloom, trees that were leafed out, birds that were there. They took me around when I read about a phoebe on a carriage eave that had made a nest. They took me around. There was the phoebe's the nest. Most of those flowers were in bloom. And that's 19 days ahead of 1947. Probably that's not really the best estimate. I think the best data is there's a book called Walden Warming by a fellow named Primark. And he and his graduate students went out and retraced the phenology that Thoreau had in his journals over a 30-year period. And they found that most of the plants were 14 to 16 days ahead of Thoreau's record. So something like the high bush blueberry was blooming and was in flower and in fruit 2 weeks ahead of. That's a probably more accurate estimate. From there, I headed across to North Carolina to the Dismal Swamp. And the Dismal Swamp at the time was not a fish and wildlife refuge. And Teale said there were sawmills running day and night and cutting the timber out of it. It was a chance to get together with Anna. We started in Feeder Ditch and we worked our way into Lake Drummond. And one thing I wanted to see there, part of the reason for making sure we retraced that trip was Teale had taken a picture of a Captain Crockett who he met, who took them from Feeder Ditch with this little boat. They have a little kind of apparatus that you can pull a boat up into Lake Drummond. And I thought, well, let's see if that's there. And sure enough, the same transport, the island was there, the same buildings were there. There was a family from Norfolk, Virginia that was camping, and I chatted them up. They said they'd been coming there for years, in large part because their children had two, a boy and a girl, could sit out in the evening and look up at the stars. You couldn't do that in Norfolk. From there, I moved pretty quickly through the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And really my guide for the Pine Barrens wasn't so much Teale as John McPhee. He has a wonderful book. That's one of the classics. I've tried assigning it to students. They're not as into the Pine Barrens as I was reading the book, but it does a wonderful job of traditions, of the natural history of it, of the social history of the people themselves, the Pineys. You really have a sense of things. But at the end of his book, he was really not very optimistic. I think it may be the same, the jet port that was the reason for this refuge, they were still thinking of putting there. And so he says at the end, he thinks that's what will happen. The last bit of really wild area is going to disappear. But that wasn't the case. Largely, I think, because of the effort of the environmental community that were galvanized by a book like that, that really provided the impetus to do something about it. In November of 1978, the National Parks and Recreation Act established the country's first national reserve, a public-private partnership with a management plan designed to promote the orderly development of the Pine Barrens so as to, quote, preserve and protect the significant and unique natural, ecological, agricultural, archaeological, historical, scenic, cultural, and recreational resources. So there have been a number of those acts since then, but in many ways, it's an ideal way that you still have businesses there, you still have houses there, but it's very carefully monitored as to, protecting the aquifer that's there and the community of plants and birds and insects. That's the village of Batstow, which is kind of like a sort of a Williamsburg, historic. I got home. I was glad to be back home. Sleeping in the truck only works for so long. I looked over the journals and I realized that when Teale was in Florida, he had followed this fellow, Ross Allen, who was a herpetologist and kind of a raconteur. He was in Silver Springs. Before Disney's empire, Silver Springs was kind of the big thing. I stopped by there, but there wasn't much there. But Teale had bagged a diamondback rattlesnake with Ross Allen. And I, consciously, unconsciously, I had no interest in bagging any rattlesnakes. So I said no to that. But when I looked at it, I thought I better do something on the reptile front here. So even though it wasn't Florida, I contacted David Carroll, who is the turtle man in New Hampshire. I don't know if he's been down here or not, but he's a wetland expert. And so I went out to his wetland in New Hampshire, kind of mid-state, and sure enough, we saw about 15 wood turtles. It had been just after the rain, and then we jumped into the wetland, and he pulled out a couple of different spotted turtles. So I thought, okay, not a rattlesnake, but I can write a little bit about my reptile, right? Then in June, the Teals had headed to Cape Cod. And so Susie and I with some friends went out to, it was the outer Cape. So they were in Wellfleet and the beaches around there. And most of the chapter that Teale writes are about he and his friend, Roger Torrey Peterson, looking at ant colonies and examining the Lilliputian forest along the coast. When we got there and looked out, there were gray seals looking back at us. No seals at that time, right? 1947, there, if you brought a seal nose in, you got a bounty. And so there were very few seals, but they've returned. We were walking in the forests around the Wellfleet kettle ponds, and out of the edge of the forest, the first bear that had been on Cape Cod since 1800, before Thoreau, was wandering, swam across and walked all the way to Provincetown and was on his way back. He was darted off the island, and because they were afraid of him being hit by cars. And 2 weeks later, he reappeared. They, put a tag on him, but not in Cape Cod, but a suburb of Boston. They had to dart him and take him again. And so I end that chapter by saying, I think now that the Outer Cape is probably Nickerson State Park, large enough and wild enough to support a young black bear like that. So on June 21st, which happens to be Susie's birthday, we put a bottle of champagne in the cog railway and headed up to the top of Mount Washington. It cost the Teals $7. It cost the Harrises $70 to go up. And we got to the top. We got to the parking lot about 10 in the morning. It was 85 degrees, predicted to be in the mid 90s for the 21st of June. The Teals were well prepared. It had been rainy the last few days, but they got to the top, and there they are in their raincoats looking out. There wasn't too much on the top of Mount Washington. There's a little more there, but it's still fairly sparse and protected. There the Harrises on the top. 50 degrees with 55 mile-an-hour winds on the top of the mountain. But we survived it. And we looked at the museum, which was quite nice they have there. There's a lot of information about Bicknell thrush, which the Teals saw when they were up there. We didn't, in that wind, we didn't see them. It didn't really feel like the time to end the trip to me, though. And so after June 21st. In early July, I went down to the home that the Teals did establish. You need to keep in mind that the book he wrote in 1951, it was published, and it was a bestseller. He appeared on Life magazine. I would argue he was the most important naturalist between Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson later. And so the success of that first book allowed him to have the wherewithal and resources to write 3 other books, the last of which in that series was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. And not a great many naturalists have won Pulitzer Prizes. During that time, they moved from Baldwin, New York, up to Hampton, Connecticut. That's why his archives at the University of Connecticut. They bought 70 acres in this house, and they put trails in. And Teale's last complete book is entitled A Naturalist Buys an Old Farm. And so I was able to walk the trails and kind of reminisce. There's a little writer's cabin that he built that you can go in. And so I ended that day in the Northampton Cemetery. That's where Nellie, Edwin Teale died first. When Nellie passed away, she donated their home and the 70 acres to the Connecticut Audubon Society. And so I'll end the presentation, and I end my book with the words there, 2 who loved this earth and loved each other.